Imagine this. You're on a plane, high above the clouds. The cabin is dimly lit, and outside, there's nothing but complete darkness, an endless night sky. The engines hum steadily in the background, and every now and then you hear the quiet click of a seatbelt or the rustle of a blanket. You lean back, glance out the window, but there's nothing. Just the black void of night. Then, suddenly, you hear a soft knock. So faint, you're not even sure it was real. And in the next moment, you feel a cold breath on the back of your neck, like someone exhaled right behind you. You turn around quickly, but there's no one there. No sound, no movement, no sign of anyone at all. And yet, you feel it deep inside. You're not alone. It may sound like the beginning of a horror film, but for many, it became an eerie reality. Pilots, flight attendants, and passengers alike have reported strange and unsettling experiences. Glimpses of figures that vanished without a trace, whispers echoing through empty cabins, voices calling out from nowhere. And remarkably, all of these accounts seem to lead back to one single flight, Eastern Airlines, Flight 401. On the night of December 29, 1972, the plane went down in the swamps of the Florida Everglades. The crash itself was tragic. Lives were lost, families shattered. But what followed in the months and years afterward would become something even more disturbing. Because for some, it seemed as though those who perished that night hadn't really left at all. Rain lashes against the windows of the cramped airplane cabin, and the mood among the passengers is tense. Some are eager to leave the icy winter of Albany behind, longing for the 4-hour journey to warm, sunny Miami. Others are absorbed in work, their briefcases wedged beneath their seats. Just another business trip, the destination secondary to the routine. But the flight is already delayed by more than an hour. The delay has stretched past an hour. A fueling issue has left the plane grounded, and the longer they wait, the heavier the silence becomes. As the tension grew, the flight attendant counted the passengers for the third time. But the numbers still didn't add up. Finally, she spotted the source of the discrepancy and made her way to a row of seats near the front of the cabin. There sat a lone male figure. As she approached, she noticed he was wearing an Eastern Airlines uniform. She assumed he was a deadheading crew member. But when she asked about his plans, he didn't respond. The man sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead at a fixed point on the cabin wall, as if he hadn't heard her at all. After several failed attempts to get his attention, and with the passengers growing increasingly uneasy, the flight attendant considered calling her supervisor. But he too was unable to get any kind of reaction. The man remained motionless, his eyes locked on some invisible point on the wall ahead. Without hesitation, the cabin manager rushed to the cockpit to alert the captain. But when the captain was led to the row in question, he froze. His eyes widened. His hand began to tremble, and without even noticing, he let go of his coffee cup. The dark liquid spilled across the cabin floor, but no one paid it any attention. Because right in front of him sat a man whose face she recognized instantly. And while the captain struggled not to panic, not to lose his grip on reality, the man's face began to change. At first it was only a faint flicker, but then it slowly started to fade, paler and paler, as if dissolving into thin air, all the while wearing an expression of eerie calm. The captain knew exactly who he had just seen. It was someone who looked exactly like a colleague who had died in a plane crash almost a year ago, on the very same route this aircraft was about to take. Late in the evening of December 29th, 1972, around 11:30 p.m., Robert Markey and Ray Dickinson were deep within the remote swamplands of the Florida Everglades. The two men knew the area well. They often came here at night to fish, drink a few beers, and enjoy some peace, far from cities and other people. But they had barely reached their favorite spot, about 30 kilometers northwest of Miami International Airport, when their hopes for a quiet evening were suddenly shattered. Out of nowhere, a deafening roar shattered the stillness of the night. The two men looked up in shock, and saw a massive, three-engine jet plummeting from the clouds. It wasn't descending, it was falling. There was no sign of a controlled approach. And then, the inevitable happened. At over 220 miles per hour, the jet's left wing slammed into the marshy ground. The force of the impact tore the aircraft apart. Metal shrieked, debris scattered in all directions, and the fuselage slammed into the earth with terrifying momentum. The landing gear and one of the engines were torn off. The cockpit and forward cabin shattered on impact. Only the tail section remained partially intact, skidding to a halt several meters away in the thick, wet soil. But there was no fire. The jet fuel and chemicals simply seeped silently into the swamp. No explosion, no towering flames, just silence. Markey and Dickinson reacted instantly. Without a second thought, they steered their boat straight into the wreckage, into the cold, dark chaos of the swamp. They pulled survivors from the water, one by one, dragging them onto patches of solid ground. Their swift actions saved lives. Ironically, the thick, muddy swamp water may have helped slow the bleeding, sealing open wounds just long enough to keep some alive. But most of the injured were in terrible shape, shattered bones, deep lacerations, and chemical burns, not from flames, but from the toxic fluids leaking silently into the marsh. The Lockheed L-1011, TriStar operating as Flight 401, was barely 6 months old. A modern aircraft, part of Eastern Airlines' pride. It had already flown the route between JFK Airport in New York and Miami International Airport many times, without incident. In the cockpit that night sat a highly experienced crew: Captain Bob Loft, First Officer Albert Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Don Repo, veterans of the skies with thousands of hours between them. Also on board was an additional technical officer, flying along for routine observation, a standard procedure for such a flight. No one aboard could have imagined that this seemingly routine journey was about to become one of the most infamous flights in aviation history. As the crew prepared for landing, First Officer Stockstill noticed something unusual. The green indicator light, the one that confirmed the landing gear was fully deployed, wasn't illuminated. Unbeknownst to the crew, the gear had in fact extended properly. The problem? A single faulty light bulb. But with no confirmation from the indicator, Captain Loft decided to delay the landing. He instructed the crew to enter a holding pattern and engage the autopilot. Then he dispatched Flight Engineer Don Repo to the avionics bay, a cramped compartment beneath the cockpit, to check whether the landing gear was actually down and locked. While coordinating the troubleshooting, Captain Loft reached toward the control panel and inadvertently nudged the control yoke. A subtle movement, so minor it went unnoticed, but it would prove to be a fatal shift, one that slowly and silently took the aircraft off course. The aircraft had entered a slow, silent descent, and no one noticed. The autopilot, still engaged, calmly maintained the downward glide. First Officer Stockstill, alone at the controls, believed everything was stable. The warning chime, meant to alert the crew that they had dropped below 2,000 feet, went unheard. Flight Engineer Don Repo, the one who would have caught it instantly, was still in the avionics bay. Outside the windows, there was nothing but darkness. No city lights, no visible landmarks, just the black, featureless void of the Everglades below. Only at the very last moment did Stockstill realize something was wrong. His reaction came fast, a sudden jolt of panic. But it was already far, far too late. Traveling at over 220 miles per hour, the aircraft slammed into the swamp. First Officer Stockstill was killed on impact. Captain Loft became trapped in the avionics bay beneath the cockpit. He died shortly afterward from his injuries. Flight Engineer Don Repo initially survived, though critically wounded. He passed away just hours later in the hospital. Of the entire flight crew in the cockpit, only the additional technical officer made it out alive. In the cabin, 8 of the 10 flight attendants survived, along with 67 of the 163 passengers on board. The cause of the crash was identified quickly during the investigation. Testimonies from surviving crew members, along with the data from the black boxes, revealed a harrowing sequence of oversights and missed warnings in the final minutes of the flight. But the story of Flight 401 didn't end in the Everglades. Because there had been no explosion, Many components of the aircraft remained remarkably intact. Several of these parts were salvaged and quietly installed in other aircraft within the Eastern Airlines fleet. Not long after that, strange things began to happen. Things no one could explain. Things that would spark one of the most chilling legends in aviation history. In the summer of 1973, a senior vice president of Eastern Airlines boarded a flight from New York to the company's headquarters in Florida. As an executive, he was seated comfortably in first class. Shortly after taking his seat, a uniformed pilot from Eastern sat down beside him. The two began chatting politely, discussing the airline, recent flights, and company matters. But the executive couldn't shake a strange feeling. The man's face looked familiar, eerily familiar. He searched his memory for a name, a moment, a connection. Then, as the pilot casually mentioned the crash from the year before, it hit him. He suddenly realized who he was sitting next to. The executive realized, with a chill running down his spine, exactly who was sitting beside him. It was Bob Loft, the long-dead captain of Flight 401. The moment the executive realized who he was speaking to, the pilot's expression changed. A flicker of awareness crossed the pilot's face, as if he suddenly understood what was happening too. And then, he vanished. No sound, no warning. 1 second he was there. The next, the seat beside him was empty. The executive jumped up in shock, visibly shaken. He demanded to leave the aircraft immediately, drawing confused looks from the cabin crew and nearby passengers. But he wouldn't, or couldn't, explain what he had seen. Only later did he say quietly, "I know who I saw, and I know he's not supposed to be here." Just weeks after the executive's encounter, another disturbing incident occurred. A female passenger began screaming uncontrollably mid-flight. Shaking and in tears, she insisted she had seen a ghost. A uniformed pilot had taken the seat next to her. He spoke with her calmly, reassuring, even friendly. But then, in the middle of a sentence, he vanished. Disappeared into thin air, right before her eyes. Later, when shown photographs of Eastern Airlines crew members, she identified him instantly and without hesitation. It was Captain Bob Loft, the man who had died in the Everglades. Word of the encounter spread quickly, and with it, the rumors, strange sightings, vanishing figures. On a routine flight from Atlanta to Miami, the cockpit crew began hearing something strange. A dull, steady knocking, coming from beneath the cockpit floor. The sound was coming from the hellhole, a narrow maintenance hatch used for electrical access. Curious and slightly uneasy, one of the flight engineers grabbed a flashlight, opened the hatch, and leaned in to take a look. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, he froze. There, staring back at him in the pale glow, was a face. A face he recognized. He recoiled in shock. It was Don Repo, the flight engineer who had died in the crash of Flight 401. A mechanic later described a strange and unforgettable encounter. He was working alone in a hangar late one night, performing routine maintenance on a TriStar jet. Suddenly, a man in an Eastern Airlines flight engineer's uniform appeared beside him and struck up a conversation. The two spoke for several minutes, casually at first. But when the mechanic mentioned the crash of Flight 401, the stranger's demeanor changed. At that moment, the stranger's expression darkened, and in a calm but resolute voice he said, "Neither I nor my colleagues will ever let another Eastern TriStar be harmed again." The next moment, he was gone. Simply vanished. The mechanic stood frozen, stunned by what had just happened. Later, when shown photos of Eastern Airlines personnel, he identified the man without hesitation. It was Don Repo. Eastern Airlines did everything it could to suppress the stories, but the accounts spread quickly, whispered through break rooms, briefing halls, and maintenance hangars. Some employees began refusing to work on aircraft that contained salvaged parts from Flight 401. It wasn't just superstition, it was fear. Fear that something, or someone, might still be attached to those pieces, that Captain Loft and Don Repo hadn't truly left, that their duty, even in death, wasn't finished. The incident that finally pushed Eastern Airlines to act took place aboard Flight 903. another Lockheed TriStar flying from JFK to Mexico City. During the flight, flight attendant Faye Merriweather suddenly froze. Through the cabin window, a face appeared, staring straight at her. A face. Calm, expressionless, familiar. Don Repo. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, but he was still there, staring straight at her from the other side of the glass. Only when a fellow attendant approached did the apparition vanish. Moments later, Merriweather heard a whisper. A voice, faint, otherworldly, spoke into her ear. "Watch out for fire on the plane." The landing in Mexico City was smooth. Everything appeared normal, but on the return flight to New York, disaster nearly struck. Without warning, the right engine caught fire mid-air. The crew reacted instantly, activating the engine's automatic fire suppression system and guiding the aircraft to a safe emergency landing. No one was injured. But during the post-flight inspection, investigators uncovered something disturbing. The aircraft contained salvaged parts that had once belonged to the wreckage of Flight 401. All salvaged parts from Flight 401 was traced, removed from every aircraft in the fleet, and permanently destroyed. From that moment on, the reports stopped. No more sightings of Captain Bob Loft, no more warnings from Don Repo, and until Eastern Airlines ceased operations in 1991, not a single Lockheed TriStar in their fleet was ever involved in another fatal accident. The case of the Flight 401 ghosts remains one of the most well-known hauntings in modern aviation. In 1978, the story was even adapted into a television movie, and to this day, it continues to be retold. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the sheer number of witnesses, many of them seasoned aviation professionals, has led many to question whether it could all have been imagination. Maybe the souls of the lost crew weren't haunting the skies. Maybe they were trying to protect them, to make sure no one else would ever share their fate. If this story gave you chills, you're not alone. What truly happened after Flight 401 disappeared into the swamp? Were those sightings just tricks of the mind, or something that refused to be forgotten? Tell us what you believe in the comments. And importantly, which mystery should we uncover next? There are countless stories buried in the dark, waiting for someone to ask the right question. So if you're drawn to the shadows between fact and fear, like this video, subscribe to The Silent Riddle and follow the trail into the unknown.